Virtua Racing is somewhat of a disappointment, and I can't really say I enjoyed much of the time I spent with the title. In brief, VR, see what they did there, feels more like a tech demo than a fully fledged product. It's a fantastic proof of concept, and from a historical perspective, it's a technical masterpiece. But that's not enough for a video game to be, and certainly not one that you're going to be investing a large amount of time in. At first, it's not that hard to look past the graphics, as they're perfectly functional, but as time progresses you realise that, actually, they have real influence on how the game plays beyond the cosmetic level. There are 3 tracks to choose from, each unfortunately with no distinctive style, as the lack of graphical fidelity hampers any ability to create anything but the most generic of spaces. And if Virtua Racing was more of an Outrun clone, that wouldn't be a problem. But this title requires memorization of speeds, corners, and the implementation of both combined. And if there's no obvious visual clue flagging up when a corner is approaching, it means you really have to learn the tracks. As in, memorize. As in, almost with the ability to drive it blindfolded. And that ties in with this Virtua theme, that it is a realistic representation of the actual activity, but it jars with itself because it doesn't provide that experience, and its gameplay mechanics just aren't sophisticated enough to allow it to. Ridge Racer got it right by sticking to one style of track, well, one track really, and playing with light and mood. But VR tries to encapsulate at least 2 real-world circuits on each course, and fails. So whilst the beginner track is a combination of the layout of Monza and the style of the Nürburgring, that just doesn't have the charm of a specifically designed racecourse that takes advantage of the processing power available. Likewise, the final track is the driving experience of Interlagos with the surroundings of Phoenix, and if you're going to have a lengthy track with buildings, you better be able to have the engine to support that vision. In fact, both of the final tracks feel like they haven't had enough attention lavished on them, as the first track is actually perfectly playable and really quite fun due to its simplicity. But this is the crux of the argument, and what really turned me off loving this title. There's no cohesion of concept. It's an arcadey racer masquerading as an F1 sim. It's all bits and pieces borrowed from here and there that just don't gel together, and that isn't exciting and fresh, it's just a mess. What would have been more interesting is to create a heavily stylized racing game that played on the fact that the graphics were going to be very polygonal. The perfect example of this is Wipeout, whose developer Fignosis realized that making the craft angular would take less power than making everything a very rough approximation of reality. It just goes to show that technology really is a major factor in video games as an art form, because if you're trying to replicate a realistic racing experience, you need to be able to account for your program managing the physics of every single bump in the road, let alone modelling a decent representation of the real world. Today's technology can, by and large, do this, but in 1994 this is just a pipe dream, and because of that, Virtua Racing feels incredibly dated. Another thing that adds to this disjointed feeling is the soundtrack. When the music kicks off, you really feel like you're having the arcade experience at home. It's quick, upbeat, dancey stuff that makes you feel, oh, it finished. Basically, because of, yes, memory constraints, there is no continuous soundtrack. There's plenty of excerpts of songs, recorded voice, and decent but heavily compressed sound effects, but the longest song in-game is less than 10 seconds in length. The developers, I feel, banked on the player getting to checkpoints faster than humanly possible, and certainly quicker than the song length, in order to keep a continuous beat alive. And because of that, the soundtrack is irritating. And that's a shame, because For chip tunes, this is excellent work and makes great use of the distinctive sound of the Mega Drive. For around £5, the Mega Drive or Saturn version of this game can be yours. Perhaps a little more for the 32X edition. And whilst that might seem a bargain, whether or not you want to buy is largely dependent on whether you think it's worth placing down money on witnessing a marvel. Because it's surely not going to be for any long-term investment. It's just not something you're likely to want to come back to that often, as the flaws aren't specifically made up for in other areas, and there are better racing titles to occupy your time with. All of this leads me to believe that this game doesn't belong on this system, or even as part of this generation, and because of that, I'd love to see Sega take another stab at this. It's a title that fell in between an awkward phase for Sega. Think about it. If you were Yu Suzuki, the game's legendary producer, would you want to release a game around the time of Sega throwing around concepts such as 32X, the Neptune, Saturn, and Katana, which would later become the Dreamcast, on a console that's just not designed to handle 3 dimensions? No. Worse, would you want to have to create a chip specifically to handle this game on current technology, just because the people in charge hadn't decided what their forthcoming strategy was? Of course not. It was a muddled time for Sega, and this release represents that. It's not as good as the arcade product from 2 years prior, and in some ways it doesn't even capture the essence of that game. And yet it is a technical marvel, and pushes the Mega Drive to its absolute limits in terms of 3D presentation. So, whilst it's easy to find a lot to respect in Virtua Racing, there's really not a lot to love. So, do you agree with what I've said here? Let me know by leaving us a message on the InRetroSpect Facebook page, or emailing me on 000@hotmail.co.uk, spelt Xero. You can keep up with us on twitter.com/InRetweetSpect, and leave us a review on iTunes. Next month is another fantastic title from 1994, but in the meantime, take it easy, play some games, and remember to download next month's InRetroSpect.